On the morning of July 27, 1988, firefighters were called to a burning house in West Hills, Los Angeles. Smoke was pouring from the home. An explosion had blown out much of its windows, and inside they found the bodies of a woman and a little girl. The girl was lying in her bed. Both had been shot in the head. Her father had poured flammable liquid through the house and over the child's body before setting it alight. He then went into the garage and shot himself. The little girl was 10-year-old Judith Barsi. Only a few days earlier, she had still been preparing for another acting job. She had already appeared in dozens of television commercials, television shows, and films. She had played in Jaws, The Revenge. She had worked on Fatal Vision, where she portrayed a little girl murdered by her own father. And now her own father had killed her. The most disturbing part of Judith Barsi's story, however, was not what happened on that morning. It was that people had been hearing about the danger inside that house long before anyone smelled the smoke. Judith Barsi was only 5 when Hollywood noticed her. She was small for her age, blonde, blue-eyed, and unusually expressive on camera. A commercial was being filmed at an ice skating rink when someone from the production noticed the little girl skating nearby. That chance encounter became the beginning of a career that moved much faster than her childhood did. By the time she was 10, Judith had appeared in roughly 72 commercials and numerous television productions. She had worked on Growing Pains, Cheers, Remington Steele, St. Elsewhere, and Fatal Vision. Then came Jaws, The Revenge, where she played Thea, one of her most recognizable live-action roles. Her career was becoming substantial enough that she was reportedly earning around $100,000 a year. Her income helped her parents buy a 3-bedroom house in West Hills in 1985. Welcome to the cursed Hollywood. But Judith's size made her career possible in a way that was also beginning to complicate her life. At 10, she was still only about 3 feet 8 inches tall. She could pass for a much younger child, which meant producers could keep casting her in roles meant for 7- and 8-year-olds. Her doctors even gave her growth-related injections at UCLA. She was getting older, but Hollywood still wanted the little girl. Away from the cameras, her life was becoming increasingly unstable. Her mother, Maria, had been the driving force behind Judith's acting career. She taught her daughter posture, poise and voice, pushed her toward auditions, and helped turn a 5-year-old who happened to be noticed at an ice rink into a working child actress. Judith's father, Jozsef, was different. He was a plumber who drank heavily and had a violent temper. A man who could become enraged over seemingly minor things. He had been arrested 3 times for drunk driving, and people who knew him described his anger as something the family had learned to live around. His relationship with Judith became especially complicated as her career took off. She was bringing money into the family. She was becoming recognizable. She was spending more time around producers, agents, and other adults in Hollywood than she was around children her own age. Her acting schedule interrupted school so often that one former classmate remembered how much Judith missed simply being with her friends. At home, meanwhile, her father's anger could turn frightening. On one occasion, Maria bought Judith a special kite. Judith became hysterical when Jozsef grabbed it because she believed he was going to break it. According to a neighbor who later recounted Maria's account, Jozsef mocked the child as a spoiled brat and deliberately destroyed the kite in front of her. It was the kind of incident that could look small from the outside. For Judith, it was another warning that even something as innocent as a new toy could become a reason for her father to explode. And the threats were becoming much darker. Maria later told police that Jozsef had spent years threatening to kill her. In December 1986, she reported that he had threatened her repeatedly and accused him of choking her and hitting her in the face. Police found no visible injuries, and Maria eventually declined to prosecute. The violence inside the house was often verbal rather than visible. That distinction would become devastatingly important. And then, in 1987, Judith left California to film Jaws, The Revenge in the Bahamas. She was 10 years old. Before she left, her father pulled a knife on her. And according to a relative, he gave his daughter a warning that would stay with her after she had crossed an ocean. If she decided not to come back, he would cut her throat. Judith went to the Bahamas. She came home 2 months later. But whatever relief she might have felt at returning to her own country disappeared when her father reminded her of the threat over the telephone. She was terrified. She cried. And then she ran to the bedroom. That was the point when Judith's fear could no longer be dismissed as a child simply being upset with her father. By the spring of 1988, Judith's fear had become visible. She had been working since she was 5. But now something was happening to the little girl her agent had once described as bubbly and happy. She was pulling out her eyelashes. She was pulling the whiskers from her cat. And then, one day, she arrived for an audition and broke down so badly that she could barely speak. Her agent, Ruth Hansen, had seen enough. She urged Maria to take Judith to a child psychologist in Encino. After Judith's first session, the psychologist contacted Hansen and told her the child's verbal, mental and emotional problems were extreme and that the situation had to be reported to Los Angeles County's Department of Children's Services. The warning had finally reached the people whose job was to protect children. In May 1988, Children's Services opened an investigation. But Judith's situation was difficult to see on paper. Most of what had happened inside the Barsi home involved threats, intimidation, and psychological abuse rather than injuries that could simply be photographed. There were also people around the family who knew what was happening. Friends had heard Jozsef threaten Maria. One family friend said Judith had told them, "I'm afraid to go home," and that her father was drunk every day and wanted to kill her mother. Maria herself had begun making plans to leave. She rented an apartment in Panorama City. The idea was that she and Judith would eventually separate from Jozsef and move there. And that hesitation became fatal. Children's Services eventually closed its investigation in June after Maria gave assurances that she had a plan to separate from her husband. Jozsef had not been warned that authorities knew about his behavior. On July 25th, Judith missed an appointment at Hanna-Barbera. Her father told Hansen that a large car had come to the house and taken Maria and Judith to San Diego. They hadn't. Police later believed Judith and Maria were killed sometime that Monday or Tuesday. On Tuesday night, July 26th, Jozsef called Hansen. He said he had decided to leave the house for good. But first, he said, he wanted to stay long enough to say goodbye to his little girl. By then, Judith had less than a day left to live. By then, Judith was already 10 years old and deeply frightened of him. And now he was alone in that house with them. The next morning, smoke began rising from the Barsi home. A neighbor, Eunice Daly, heard an explosion and saw the house burning. She ran to call 911, and her first thought was not that there had been an accident. She remembered what Jozsef had threatened to do. He's done it, she thought. He had killed them and set the house on fire, just as he had said he would. Firefighters forced their way into the damaged house. Judith was found in her bedroom, in her bed. Her mother, Maria, was lying in the hallway. Both had been shot once in the head. Jozsef was found in the garage with a gun. He had killed himself after murdering his wife and daughter. Police said he had poured gasoline over Judith's body or bed and throughout the hallway before setting the house on fire. The resulting blaze was so violent that it caused an explosion and blew out most of the windows. The little girl who had spent years appearing on television was gone. The authorities later learned that Judith's family had been asking for help. She had already completed work on 2 animated films before her death: The Land Before Time and All Dogs Go to Heaven. Neither had been released yet, so while the people who loved Judith were burying a 10-year-old child, audiences were still about to meet her for the first time. In The Land Before Time, she became the voice of Ducky, the cheerful little dinosaur whose voice would become one of the most recognizable parts of the film. Then came All Dogs Go to Heaven. Judith voiced Anne-Marie, a young orphan girl who can talk to animals. It was her final film role, released in 1989, more than a year after her death. The film ended up carrying something that nobody involved had expected when Judith recorded her lines. Her voice had survived her. The production was deeply affected by her death. Director Don Bluth later recalled that the news nearly paralyzed the production, and that work temporarily stopped while the cast and crew dealt with what had happened. And then came the song. The end credit song, Love Survives, was dedicated to Judith, a little girl who had spent her childhood recording lines for animated characters, was now being remembered through a song she would never hear in a theater. But Judith's story did not end with the release of those films. The case also forced attention back onto the warnings that had come before her death. The child protection investigation that had been closed weeks earlier was reopened for scrutiny. Los Angeles County officials later criticized the handling of the case, including the decision to close it despite concerns about the family's situation. Judith had been 10 years old. She had spent almost half her life working in Hollywood. She had been on television, in films, and behind a microphone creating characters that would outlive her. But the most painful part of remembering her is not the fame. It is how ordinary the final warning sounded. A little girl was afraid to go home, and eventually there was no home to go back to. Judith's death did not end the questions, created new ones. Within weeks, attention turned toward the Los Angeles County Department of Children's Services. The agency had known about the family's problems. Judith's agent had raised concerns. Her psychologist had reported what she was seeing in the child. Family friends had described Jozsef's threats. Yet the investigation had been closed in June. Now a county watchdog commission wanted to know why. A judge ordered the department to open its files so the commission could examine how Judith's case had been handled. The most disturbing detail was not simply that the case had been closed. It was what apparently had not happened before it was closed. According to people involved in the review, no worker had gone to the Barsi home to confront Jozsef about his behavior. Judith's therapist had not been told that the case was closed. And the commission questioned whether Judith herself had ever been properly interviewed about what was happening to her. The explanation given by the department was that Maria had a plan. She had rented the Panorama City apartment. She intended to separate from her husband, so the agency allowed her to carry out that plan. But the plan never happened in time. And after Judith was murdered, the county's own advisory commission concluded that the investigation had been dropped prematurely. The social worker assigned to the case had been carrying 67 cases, 27 more than what was considered a full caseload. There was another uncomfortable issue. Judith's suffering had been largely emotional. That meant there were no obvious wounds for someone to photograph and point to. Her fear showed itself differently. The eyelashes she pulled out, the distress that overwhelmed her during an audition, the fear of returning home, the things she reportedly told people around her. The commission later specifically criticized the tendency to focus on abuse that could be physically seen, warning that emotional abuse could be just as threatening to a child. But Judith herself never got the chance to see whether the adults would finally understand. When the public learned that Judith's mother had gone to Los Angeles County's Department of Children's Services just 2 months before the killings, the story changed. This was no longer simply a case of a father suddenly losing control. There had been warnings, and those warnings had reached the child protection system. Judith's agent had raised concerns, and still the investigation was closed in June. The Commission for Children's Services was so troubled by what it learned that it went to court to obtain the confidential case files. It wanted to know why the investigation had been closed and whether the system had missed something that could have saved a child's life. The review uncovered another problem. Judith's suffering was not necessarily the kind that left an obvious bruise. Her fear had appeared in other ways. She pulled out her eyelashes. She pulled the whiskers from her cat. She became hysterical during an audition. She told people she was afraid to go home, and her father had threatened to kill her. Those were not imaginary signs. They were pieces of a pattern that, by the time the investigation was reviewed, had become impossible to ignore. The Land Before Time reached theaters in November 1988. Only months after Judith's death. All Dogs Go to Heaven followed in 1989. Her performances were now permanent, preserved inside movies that would introduce her voice to generations of children who would know nothing about the house in West Hills. The screen preserved the happiest version of Judith. The real girl had been living something very different.